The Isle of Pelisse, Part 3. The Battle of Three-Legged Cross. Defeated and disconsolate, the Earl of Westwood and his battered army retreated from Cloverfield, reversing their previous path, marching through Holtzheim and over the river Hilda, back into the territory of Westwood. Here they joined up with the Woodlands foresters, who had been driven from that town by King Ludwig. King Ludwig's intention was to advance from Woodlands and cut off the Earl's retreat. However, he failed to act quickly enough to achieve this. By the time the body of his army had reached the road, the Earl's force had already passed along it. King Ludwig's cavalry did manage to contact the Earl's rearguard, although no engagement took place. Concerned that he would be harried by King Ludwig's cavalry, the Earl ordered his combined force to continue its retreat all the way to the inn at Three-Legged Cross. This stood at the junction where the road to Needham branched from the road between East Harbour and Hildermouth. Here it was that the Earl determined to make his stand. King Ludwig paused to allow the forces that he had sent to Princess Ophelia's aid to join him. He sent a letter to Princess Ophelia, requesting that she and the Hildermead Hussars accompanied them. However, the princess declined to do so. Her stated reason for this was that her presence was required at home to restore order in the regions that had been invaded by the Earl of Westwood, and that she did not wish to leave her realm defenceless by sending what remained of her army to join King Ludwig. There was also a suggestion that she was irritated by the peremptory tone adopted by the king, and felt that he was taking her for granted. By the 18th of May, King Ludwig had completed his preparations and resumed his advance. On the morning of the 20th of May, the Earl of Westwood received tidings that the king's army was approaching Three-Legged Cross. The road from Needham ran along a valley between two long hills. At the end of the valley was the road junction. At the junction was the small village of Three-Legged Cross, consisting of the inn and a couple of cottages. The bare landscape was broken by two small woods, one on either side of the village. Between these two patches of trees, blocking the Needham road, the Earl of Westwood arranged his 3 regiments of infantry in mixed order. On his right, as the senior regiment, he placed the Earl's own foot in a massed column. On the left were the Woodlands foresters, also in a massed column. Between these two blocks of men were the Hildermouth Fusiliers deployed in line. Major Montmorency and the light dragoons were positioned on the far right flank, beyond the wood on that side. King Ludwig's army came marching down the Needham road. The king's light foot, in open order, screened the head of the force. Behind them was a long column of infantry, headed by the 1st Royal Foot Guards. Behind this regiment rode King Ludwig, followed by the 2nd and 3rd Royal Foot Guards. The king's artillery, consisting of a battery of 8-pounder field guns, brought up the rear. On either side of the road a column of cavalry screened the flanks, the king's heavy horse to the right and the king's light horse to the left. Observing the Earl of Westwood's forces, King Ludwig ordered the 1st Regiment of Royal Foot Guards to continue down the road, marching past the king's light foot, who veered to the right, forming an extended line behind which the 2nd and 3rd Regiments of Royal Foot Guards could deploy into battle formation. The king's heavy horse took up a position on the far right, beyond the line of light infantry. On the left flank, the king's light horse halted and reformed into a line. It seems that the officers had been drilling the troopers, as the change of formation was achieved in an orderly and timely manner, a distinct contrast with the unit's performance at the Battle of Cloverfield. The light infantry now advanced to a position ahead of the 1st Royal Foot Guards, who had halted and deployed into line formation. On their right, the 2nd Royal Foot Guards, still in column, moved up alongside them. Still further to the right, and somewhat to the rear, the 3rd Royal Foot Guards continued to advance into position. On the left flank, the King's Light Horse trotted forward, attempting to keep in formation with the infantry. The King's artillery had halted in the rear, and was showing no sign of activity. Notwithstanding the indolence of the King's artillery, its presence was causing the Earl of Westwood no little concern. He rode over to Major Montmorency and suggested to that gentleman that he and his light dragoons should pay the artillerymen a visit, and distract them from any attempt to launch cannonballs at the massed ranks of the Westwood infantry. Riding through the entire enemy army in order to charge a line of cannon was precisely the type of gallant adventure that appealed to Major Montmorency, who was therefore delighted to act as proposed. Bugles sounded, and the light dragoons galloped forward. Major Montmorency's route to the guns took him closely past the King's Light Horse, who might reasonably have been expected to take some action to impede his progress. However, they did not. It is not clear whether this was for reasons of general ineptitude, or because of a reluctance to provide the light dragoons with an opportunity to reenact the mauling that they had inflicted upon the King's Light Horse at the Battle of Cloverfield. Thus it was that the light dragoons swept unchallenged across the field, deep into the enemy's rear, and charged into the midst of the still limbered guns. The light dragoons fully expected to have quite an easy time of it, sabring hapless artillerymen. However, this attack roused the King's artillery from its torpor, and the gunners put up an unexpectedly stout resistance, discomforting the horsemen and holding them, at least for the moment, at bay. King Ludwig was rather proud of his artillery. He did not wish to see it destroyed. He put his spurs to his horse and recklessly galloped back down the road toward his beleaguered cannon, the officers of his staff trailing reluctantly after him. Arriving on the scene, he immediately started barking orders, and the artillerymen began to unlimber the guns. Major Montmorency rebuked his troopers for their lack of resolution, and regathered them, preparing to renew his assault upon the King's artillery. However, observing that the guns were being brought into action, and wary of the King's Light Horse to his rear, he had second thoughts. Realizing that the situation had the potential to become extremely sticky, he decided that he was about to pass the point where cavalier daring becomes suicidal idiocy, and he caused the retreat to be sounded. The light dragoons therefore galloped jauntily back the way they had come, once again riding around the King's Light Horse, who once again showed no inclination to impede the progress of their foes. However, the light dragoons did not get off entirely free. As they receded into the distance, a number of cannonballs were fired in their direction by the King's artillery, and a proportion of these were directed with an accuracy adequate to do some damage to the dragoons. The Earl of Westwood congratulated himself that, even if it was somewhat painful for the light dragoons, his plan to distract the attention of the gunners from his infantry had succeeded. He rode back over to that infantry to see how they had been getting on in his absence. He found them apprehensively watching the menacing massed manoeuvres of King Ludwig's royal foot guards. Each regiment of King Ludwig's Royal Foot Guards was facing off against one of the line infantry regiments of the Earl of Westwood. The first Royal Foot Guards, deployed into line, were advancing down the road toward the Earl's own regiment of foot. The second Royal Foot Guards had also formed into line and taken up a position opposite the Hildermouth Fusiliers. On the right, the third Royal Foot Guards were still in a column of march, having only just arrived at their intended position opposite the Woodlands Foresters. The Foresters were also being threatened by the King's heavy horse, who had taken up a position on the far right flank of King Ludwig's army. In front of the second Royal Foot Guards, the King's light foot had formed a textbook skirmish line and had advanced to within rifle range of the Hildermouth Fusiliers. The Earl of Westwood responded by ordering the Hildermouth Fusiliers to advance toward the light infantry and drive them off. He also ordered the Woodlands Foresters and the Earl's own regiment to advance and protect the flanks of the Hildermouth Fusiliers. Once more the Earl saw his plan crowned with some success. The Hildermouth Fusiliers advanced and fired 2 crashing volleys into the King's light foot, which pretty much put paid to them as any sort of fighting force. On the Fusiliers' left, the Woodlands Foresters advanced as instructed. However, on their right, the Earl's own regiment did not. Brigadier Hapgood shouted increasingly furious and incoherent instructions at his men, who uncomprehendingly remained rooted in place, until the Earl himself took personal charge of the situation and succeeded in getting the appropriate commands relayed to the troops in order to achieve the desired result. This intervention by the Earl did not improve the Brigadier's mood. The destruction of the light infantry did not deter King Ludwig's army from its plan of attack. The initial preparations for the assault were completed as the 3rd Regiment of Royal Foot Guards deployed into line. And then cavalry bugles sounded, and the King's heavy horse thundered toward the Woodlands Foresters, intending to soften them up before the 3rd Royal Foot Guards went in to finish the job. The cavalry charge did not have the outcome that King Ludwig had anticipated. As the heavy horsemen closed with the Foresters, they were greeted with a lethal volley of musketry. Those horsemen that survived this found themselves impaled on an implacable hedge of steel bayonets. Far from softening up the infantry, the cavalry only succeeded in shattering itself upon an apparently immovable object. The 3rd Royal Foot Guards observed the carnage and abandoned their intention of crossing bayonets with the Woodlands Foresters. However, the 2nd Royal Foot Guards were made of sterner stuff and advanced in a military manner toward the Hildermouth Fusiliers. As the 2nd Royal Foot Guards approached, the Hildermouth Fusiliers stepped forward to meet them, discharged their muskets in a single devastating volley, and then charged in with the bayonet. The ranks of the 2nd Royal Foot Guards disintegrated, and its surviving soldiery ignominiously fled the field. At this point, King Ludwig decided that he should withdraw from the fray, while he still had some army left with which to fight another day. He caused the retreat to be sounded. The King's light horse reacted to this immediately, executing a parade ground perfect about face and cantering briskly toward the rear. The 3rd Royal Foot Guards formed back into a column of march and withdrew. But the 1st Royal Foot Guards were reluctant to run away without a show of defiance. They discharged a well-drilled volley at the Earl's own regiment, before turning on their heels and marching back down the road. The Earl of Westwood vocally encouraged the Earl's own regiment to pursue the First Royal Foot Guards and seek to do them some injury with lead or steel. But the Earl's own regiment had been somewhat shaken by the musketry of the First Royal Foot Guards, and despite Brigadier Hapgood's efforts, could not be induced to do so. As the army of King Ludwig streamed from the field, the king's artillery turned its fire upon the westward infantry. This worked better than King Ludwig could have hoped. Not only did it force the Earl of Westwood to pull his troops back out of the line of fire, preventing him from making any pursuit of King Ludwig's army, but one particularly well-aimed cannonade ripped through the ranks of the Hildemouth Fusiliers, killing the commander, Colonel Chesterton, along with large numbers of his men, and causing the entire unit to break up in confusion and panic. With that, the gunners limbered the guns and followed their fellows from the field. Thus it was that the Earl of Westwood came of age as a military commander, and stemmed the advance of King Ludwig. And so ended the Battle of Three-Legged Cross.